Hello. This program is going to be about Nordic music, specifically in Iceland and Norway. And much of the focus is going to be on either folk song and the role of that type of genre in these two countries, as well as the romantic character piece, which does an awful lot to show nationalism, patriotism in these two countries as well. The first composer I'm going to present is Sveinbjörnsson, who was born in 1847 and died in 1927. He was born in Seltjarnarnes, which is basically in Reykjavik, and he passed away in Copenhagen. And it shouldn't come as any surprise that he was in Copenhagen when he died, because Copenhagen was the center of everything for Icelanders at the time. Iceland did not gain its independence until 1944 and had been ruled by Denmark since the 1500s. So it was a colony of Denmark for many, many years. And so Copenhagen was the center of everything for an Icelander for many years. Sveinbjörn was really the very first composer of genius from Iceland, and there wasn't much of a professional music career that one could make at that time in Iceland, so he ended up moving to Edinburgh in Scotland, where he spent most of his life. And his compositions include not just beautiful piano pieces, but also piano trios, and he was also known as the composer of the Icelandic national anthem. This particular piece, Vikivaki dance, is a folk tune in Iceland. It's actually one that is sung very regularly on New Year's Eve every year, and it celebrates basically a bonfire that is lit every year, where they are burning out the old year. And they select an elf queen and an elf king, and everyone dances around the bonfire. The poetry for this was actually by Jón Ólafsson, who was a poet in Iceland at the time, but the actual tune is not Icelandic, it's Faroese, which is quite typical of this time period because Iceland's folk tunes tend not to be terribly melodic, shall we say, and much of what was borrowed at this time was from Germany and other countries as well, and thus the more melodic texture to the melodic interest. So the poem for this reads, "The moon high on the heaven shines, pale and gray. Life and time passes, and a year has passed. Raise the torches up high, reflecting glow on the ground, grinning moon, but the crowd squeals, and quickly time flies." The next composer I'm going to discuss is Páll Ísólfsson, who lived from 1893 to 1974. Páll, along with another composer, Jón Leifs, was responsible for building up much of what was Icelandic musical culture at the time. When he went to study, he went to Leipzig, and he became an incredible organist. In fact, he became one of the 5 very best organists in all of Europe. And he could have had any job he wanted. All he had to do was just audition, and he would have gotten it. But he realized he had some work to do at home. And so he came home to Iceland, and he became the director of the newly established Iceland radio service. He also helped establish the Icelandic Reykjavik School of Music and College of Music. And also he did an awful lot for helping and encouraging composers and musicians, and did a lot of conducting and interviewing also of many farmers throughout all of Iceland and asking them to sing their old folk songs for the whole country. So he did an awful lot to help the country remember itself and understand its own culture. These pieces are 3 of his most famous of the 3 of all of his music that he wrote, and it's 3 piano pieces, opus 5, and it starts with a burlesca, it goes into an intermezzo, and then it ends with a really quite beautiful and difficult capriccio. But they are delightful pieces. You will find that they do mimic much about Brahms and Mendelssohn. There's even a little bit of Grieg in there as well. But in the first movement, you will hear the trace of the Vikivaki dance that you heard by Sveinbjörnsson, which is quite entertaining. The next composer I'll discuss is Þorkell Sigurbjörnsson. And Þorkell did much about carrying on the torch from Páll. He was part of the group of composers that really became quite important right after World War II. And he did an awful lot for Icelandic musical culture. He helped establish the Iceland Music Information Center. He was very active in the Iceland Composers Association. He was a radio critic and a newspaper critic. He had a long time radio program in Iceland where he played modern music for Icelandic people. He was a composition teacher. He was an incredibly fine pianist, and I could keep going on and on and on. He was born in 1938 and passed away in 2013, and I had the great pleasure and privilege of spending one of my Fulbright grants interviewing him for half a year. And my work with him is not done. It's just beginning. I did actually end up publishing a book of his piano music, and there are other editions of all of the rest of his music forthcoming in the coming years. But this was my first endeavor into this area. This particular work, Lagstúfur fyrir Vigdísi, or Arietta for Vigdís, was written in 1981 on the first anniversary of the presidency of Iceland's first female president, Vigdís Finnbogadóttir. And she wasn't just the first female president of Iceland, she was the first democratically elected female president in the entire world. So it was a rather significant event for this to happen. This piece is very based on Icelandic folk tune elements, and I want to take a moment to explain those here. The first element that you will find is the incredible amount of use of fourths and fifths in the music. And this definitely comes from a particular type of Icelandic folk song called tvísöngur, or twin song. Now, those who have studied music history will understand that this is very related to early polyphony, the idea of using perfect fifths in sort of parallel motion with each other. And this was something that had come to Iceland prior to them even being ruled by Norway, which was taken over in 1380. But Iceland, this particular type of Icelandic folk song is quite amazing because it was one of the main forms of music making for basically 1,000 years until Romantic nationalism came to Iceland, basically from the students who were studying in Copenhagen and Leipzig, where they brought that tradition back with them. So up till then, a lot of the folk songs that were sung were in one of these two traditions. Here is an Icelandic folk song which uses the perfect parallel fifths. The second type of Icelandic folk song is called rimur. It has an awful lot to do with the English word rhyme, and basically is indicated basically by a changing meter that happens progressively over and over and over. So in this piece we have 4 beats, 3/4, 4/4, 2/4, 4/4. So it has that changing meter. There's an Icelandic folk song which is a rina dance, and it goes Hanni krummi hundur svín hestur mústið lingur gallar grungar geltir finnekkjar tístir syngur. You hear the changing meter, and it has to do with the inflection and the syllabic emphasis of the Icelandic language. You can hear both of these elements in this particular work, and I think it's a lovely present to a president on her first anniversary. The next composer I'll talk about is Hafliði Hallgrímsson, who was a very dear and important friend to Þorkell Sigurbjörnsson. He was born in 1941 and ended up living in Scotland after he studied in London. And he became first cellist in an orchestra there in Scotland. Later on in his life, he decided to focus his attention on composition, so he dropped that and ended up writing this particular work in 1985. It is dedicated to Philip Jenkins, a British pianist. This particular work, this particular folk song, is a really sad one, Sofðu, unga, ástin mín, which means sleep, my little loved one, my young loved one. The English title he gives is Lullaby on a Winter's Night. There is an Icelandic saga about a real man who was an outlaw, and he ended up having to flee to the highlands of Iceland, which basically no one's able to live up on the heath in Iceland. It's very inhospitable. It's the Arctic Circle after all, but somehow he managed to do it. No one before him or after him has ever been able to do this. And this was a terrible time in Icelandic history. There was a very great famine. Food was extremely scarce. The ocean had frozen over, so there was no way to really do any fishing. The sheep were ill. The horses were not doing great either. People were resorting to eating grass to be able to survive, and those who dared to steal a sheep and were caught were sent to Copenhagen to face trial. Sometimes they were facing the death penalty. Some were just put into slavery for the rest of their lives. So to be able to escape and be an outlaw was a better fate in many ways. Well, as it just so happened, this outlaw fled to the highlands with his wife, and they did have children, but there became too many mouths to feed, and unfortunately, it became necessary in some cases to take a child, a baby, up into the highlands and give them to the elves, as it were. So this is a very, very sad piece, and the lullaby is to a dead child, and you can hear the iciness creeping into this piece. The next piece is by Karólína Eiríksdóttir. Karólína was a student of Þorkell's, and she basically considers herself to be a composer. That's really what she does with her life. She was born in 1951, and she has composed a lot of really incredible music, including operas and so forth. This particular folk song setting was written in 2004, along with some others, and it is named Liljulagið, or the Song of Lily. This is the oldest folk song in Iceland that is known, and it was written down by, I believe it was a Scottish traveler who wanted to notate this music. And they say that either he wrote it down wrong or somebody sang really badly, because you'll hear it very quickly when I play the melody that it makes no sense. It's not major, it's not minor, it's not in any mode, it's not Lydian or Phrygian. It's actually, I analyzed it a little bit, and it's actually octatonic with a little twist at the end. So it's a very strange mode that this particular piece is in. Let me play it for you. And that's the oldest Icelandic folk song that we know. It's interesting to note that Þorkell wrote his own version of this particular folk song, and I cannot help but feel like Karólína was maybe influenced by it. The final piece that I'm going to present to you by an Icelandic composer is by Snorri Sigfús Birgisson, who was born in 1954. In about 2005-2006, he put together a set of very many folk songs, arrangements, that he published, and actually they are, as I understand it, free on the internet if you would like to print them out and play them yourself. Gilsbakkiþula, or Look Up Gilsbakkimann, is essentially a folk tune that is a Christmas song. And it is a piece that is welcoming people to the home to come on in and be welcome at Christmas. And the interesting thing is he's actually dedicated this to his sister, who's a very fine flutist, and her whole family. So I think that's quite beautiful. Snorri is an incredibly active composer. He is still composing extremely all the time, like it's just nonstop. There are pieces that are basically still, the ink is still drying, and they're being performed. So he's very, very active and does a lot of teaching as well. So I find him to be a very, very fine composer and a really, really nice guy. So I encourage you to look into his music. This next piece is by a female Norwegian composer named Agathe Bäcker-Grøndahl. I came across her music because I had actually assigned one of her pieces to one of my students, and I was very, very taken with it. And so I decided to go into more detail about her music, and I have found it to be very intriguing and very rewarding to play. Agathe Bäcker-Grøndahl was actually a contemporary of Edvard Grieg. They were friends. They knew each other, and in fact, she was considered one of the great interpreters of his concerto that he wrote. She also was an incredibly fine pianist. She had studied with Franz Liszt, among many others, and was considered just as great a composer as Clara Schumann, and pianist as well. So very, very popular musician at the time who has been sadly very forgotten after her death. This particular set of pieces, Opus 15, it's just simply 3 pieces again. I'm just going to play the first one for you today. Is entitled Serenade, and it's very typical of this romantic character piece. But I find her harmonies to be intriguing and beautiful and very clever. I will tell you also her etudes. I would almost say I'd pit them up against one of Chopin's or Liszt's in quality and difficulty for the pianist in many ways. So her music is worth exploring, and I hope that you will go ahead and look into some of her work. She wrote a lot for piano, and much of it is very, very rewarding. There's even some teaching pieces, some very short, lovely little character pieces for developing pianists as well. The last piece I'll play for you today is Ballad of Revolt by Harald Sæverud, one of the, if not the most important Norwegian composer of the 20th century. He lived to be rather old and had quite an influence on Norwegian music making and composition. This particular piece I find to be quite powerful, and I think you will as well. It is from a set of pieces called Tunes and Dances from Siljestøl, which is his home in Bergen, which you can still visit. Basically, it is dedicated to the home front's large and small champion fighters. It was written about 1941 and was basically about that the Nazis had invaded Norway. And Norway fought back against the Nazis, and there were some people who would go on their skis and go out and go after the Nazis on their skis in the Norwegian forests. And so he wrote this piece as sort of a battle hymn to the great Norwegians who were fighting back against the oppressors and those that had invaded his land. It's become, I think, one of my absolute favorite Nordic pieces. It's very powerful, and I hope you enjoy it.